I'm Bob Thomas. I'm with Export Expert. I'm currently in Panama City, Panama. And my guest today is Rand Brenner, who you may have seen on some other videos of ours. And I will let Rand explain what he does.
Hello, Bob. Always good to see you and be with you. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video. My name is Rand Brenner. My company is Licensing Consulting Group. And what I do is I work with IP owners, small businesses, innovators, entrepreneurs, and helping them license their intellectual property. We manage the business side of licensing. We don't do any legal work, although we do understand how to negotiate the terms and all that, but we work on figuring out how to put the deals together and make money. So I'm very pleased to be here with Bob because we're going to be talking about how you make money with intellectual property if you're looking to go outside the United States.
Right. And let me start. And I know that when you talk about intellectual property, you're mainly dealing with probably trademarks and patents. Whereas I'd like to find out what would be the steps for a person to license their actual product. And this is a case where, say, in the United States, they have this retail product that's really going through the roof. And they just don't have time to develop any other markets because the US market is taking all their time. How would they go about getting that out without any large expense?
Well, that's where licensing comes in. We do work with companies that have products and devices, licensing them out. So licensing is a strategy. It's a go-to-market strategy. Okay, many people don't realize that it's not an either or. It's actually a complementary strategy. And when we say go to market, it could be your single market that you want to go to in the United States, or perhaps you're thinking of expanding, as we're talking about here, and going internationally. So, what licensing does is enable you to use your underlying IP for your product and find partners outside the United States who would be interested in acquiring the rights through licensing to make and sell your product, um, and sell it or distribute it into one or more countries around the world. And it's an effective strategy, especially if you're a small, mid-sized company and you don't have the resources, as Bob had mentioned, to actually do that direct or to even manage the additional operational overhead required to get into those international markets.
Okay, so let's talk about a product just as an example that you would be familiar with, and that would be a coffee mug. And let's say a company has come out with this fantastic coffee mug that keeps your coffee at the right temperature for the whole length of the coffee cup. Obviously, there probably is a patent involved. If not, there's a trademark involved. Let's look at what steps that person would take to get that product into a foreign market without any major expense.
Okay. Well, if they, electing to deploy the licensing strategy be the most effective way. And licensing is a process. Many people think of licensing as a legal thing, a legal agreement. That is part of it, but licensing is a process. It's much like the marketing process or the production process or whatever it is. You have to take certain steps to get into the market. So one of those is determining that you are interested in expanding internationally. Obviously, determine what countries or territories that you are looking to expand into, and then putting together a licensing strategy to outreach to potential partners in those territories or countries. Now, if you don't have the know-how or the resources to do it yourself, that's where bringing in, expertise such as you or myself to assist with that process in managing it. For most of my assignments are working with IP owners, small businesses, entrepreneurs, startups, and they are looking for assistance in licensing out their product or their technology. And so what they do is they engage my company, to manage the entire outbound licensing process from strategy and planning through figuring out who to target, reaching out to them, and contacting them, and negotiation and compliance. So having the know-how, not only of the licensing process, but of the market is a very important step. And that's where, your expertise, especially in Latin America, can be very uh, important for a company who is interested in licensing, but is looking for, who are the right partners, because it's all about your partner. You got to get the right partner. If it's not a good partner, it's going to lead to a lot of headaches, as you and I have discussed many times. So that would be the process. Not, licensing isn't a money intensive or uh, process, but it does take time. Okay, it's certainly nowhere near the expense of setting up your own international operation. It's a fraction of that. But like anything else, it takes time. Just like it may have taken you, 18 months to 2 years to launch your product, licensing will take, time as well. How much time it takes depends on your product. Let's say you're talking about the mug that you'd mentioned. The mug is going to be a little faster timeline, because it's a non-complex product, doesn't require regulatory approval, and is relatively simple to produce and distribute and sell. And then of course, a lot of it has to do with distribution. There's a lot of places that you can sell the mug in retail, distribution throughout the world. And that's another area where I know you could help them, is setting up the distribution for that. Because you want to make sure that whoever your partner is also going to be able to sell it, which requires getting it into retail.
Yeah, okay, with the coffee mug up, and you mentioned compliance and regulatory agencies. There are so many more or there are so many more regulations and standards that a U.S. company wouldn't be aware of, because in the United States, a company gets sued if the product doesn't meet certain standards, and it's usually as a case of an accident. In other countries, you have to get the standards of the product approved before you can bring it into the country. I think that a coffee mug that's made out of China, not the country, but the material, or some type of plastic, would have to go through a regulatory clearance, just to make sure that, one, it doesn't contain any lead, which is a big problem. And then just some labeling requirements, but not anything significant. It would be very easy to get through. You're talking about a laboratory test and then the approval of the agency. Picking the market, say a coffee cup, you could sit at home and say, go to some AI place and say, where are the biggest coffee drinkers in the world? And that would tell you a very good place to put your market. The I think the next thing is, let's talk about what kind of costs it would take for a company that is having a Chinese production facility make their product. They're selling it very successfully in the United States, and they want to license it. What steps now, and about, not talking about cost, but each step would be a cost.
Well, from a licensing perspective, the cost steps per se, really the major costs would be, if you're not going to do it yourself, it would be retaining, as I said, somebody such as myself, and and you, to help guide them. Those would be the major costs, as well as the legal expenses. It's really about the time. So, you're talking 15, $20,000, maybe a bit more, depending on what type of services they engage for. And As far as additional costs, that would have to do, as you mentioned, about if there's regulatory approvals or product approvals that you have to get in the country, then obviously you have to submit for that. And working with somebody such as yourself who's familiar and understands these countries and their bureaucratic regulatory approval processes can help facilitate that. Although it is the responsibility, there's an important point here. Although it is the responsibility generally of your licensing partner to take care of that, if you have a limitation of resources in terms of what you would be able to do to support your licensing partners international, and if you're looking for a way to better monitor the situation, then that's where it really becomes an important decision to bring somebody such as yourself on board, who is in effect the boots on the ground, who can work directly with the licensee and making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because part of the licensing process, you have a product, you want to make sure that they're producing it correctly, it looks right, all that sort of stuff. And beyond that, make sure that they're selling it and supporting it and doing all that. And if there's, things that need to be done and that you need the support to get it done, then you needed the expertise, your expertise to be the person that's available on site, that speaks the language, that can go down, that can talk to the companies and make sure they're doing what they're doing. And that's where it gets back to that question I mentioned about partner. It's all about the partner. I mean, one of the best things about, for example, utilizing your services, and I'm going to speak here in conjunction with my services on the licensing side, is that you have a great ability to complete due diligence on your prospective partners. We've been having some very productive conversations and negotiating with a company, and now the final step is the verification, just to make sure their manufacturing is what they say it is, or their products or whatever it is. And that's where it can be really important to have somebody such as yourself who's able to go in and provide that verification. So coming back around to your question about the cost, those are really the costs involved. They wouldn't necessarily break out on a step-by-step basis, but it would be, costs that are involved to make sure that the licensing and the completion of the deal and getting the licensee onboarded and up and running and producing and all that are part of it. And it's generally, a fee or retainer structure to have the expertise on your team to make sure that it's done correctly.
Okay, and I think as you were explaining, what was happening in the process, I was thinking that even though the upfront costs they may have, I see savings in inventory, I see savings in freight, I see savings in advertising if you have your partner and responsible for the advertising, which he should be because he's going to be doing the sales.
Absolutely.
And I see quite a bit of savings there. And then you look at, everybody thinks, oh, gee, I can't get in licensing what I can get in gross margin. When you compare the licensing fee to the net profit, then it begins to look a little bit more attractive.
Actually, that's a really good point. Everybody, one thing I find is always, not always, but I'll say is frequently is a point that people tend to grasp onto is the royalty rate. And when they're presented with a royalty rate of 3 or 5%, suddenly it's like, oh my God, that's so low, it's not enough. Well, going to your point exactly, you have to remember that when you're licensing and receiving a royalty rate, that's money that's going to your bottom line because you're not putting up the expenses for everything you just said, the operations, the inventory, the production, the risk, the distribution, the advertising, the promotion. When you take all of that into account, deduct all of those expenses on average across many industries, you'll find that a royalty rate of 5% is a pretty close to what you would be netting on the bottom line. if you were doing it direct. So while it seems in many situations, especially products, and I've seen this in many times, even going back to my days in the studios, it seems like, oh, I can make a lot more selling direct. Well, initially it seems like you're making a lot more, but at the end of the day, by the time you deduct all those expenses, and then there's a whole bunch of unknowns and returns, allowances, and everything else, your net isn't going to be much higher than that.
And
5-6%. That's just
don't
what
forget,
it is. And
don't forget foreign currency risk.
right. Well, then there's foreign currency risk, which, by the way, you can take care of in license agreement because you don't have to bear that. See, the nice thing about licensing is, yes, one of the most effective reasons to go international through a license is for the very things that you pointed out, a significant reductions in cost, a significant reductions in risk. And you can take care of things like currency fluctuations. And in fact, I had a very large situation like that when I was working in the studios. I was managing Mexico when I was head of licensing at Saban on the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And um, we were doing deals with companies in Mexico for the rights to produce the toys and the t-shirts, the hats, and everything else. And all of the license agreements were in US dollars. So whatever they were selling for in pesos, they had to convert to dollars for remittance of the royalties. And, when you have when the currency is stable, it's generally agreeable. I mean, in most cases, they can account for it. In other cases, what happened in this case is Mexico had a currency crash and the peso suddenly devalued significantly. And the licensees were coming back. And you have to remember, we had dozens of licensees, a lot of money on the line. So we basically had to work out an internal or our own exchange rate to compensate for it, because now with the devaluation of the peso, they could not afford to pay in dollars because the royalty rates just skyrocketed. They were like 30% equivalent. So we had to make an adjustment for that. Now that's just, an example, but it goes back to your point. Yes, licensing agreements are a good way to manage the currency fluctuations, especially if you negotiate them in dollars, because it helps minimize what you have to pay out. And it's not uncommon for license agreements to require the licensee to absorb currency exchange fees as well. So good point. And there's a lot of depth and breadth to this, which obviously we can't get into, but there's a lot of strategic opportunities and ways of using licensing internationally that can really maximize your return and minimize things like this, like the cost currency fluctuations, things like that.
Right. And there was a strategy at one point in Mexico where they limited the export of dollars for certain things. Okay, so you bring up a point, and I was going to mention the problem with Mexico. At one point, they stopped the exportation of dollars, which really created a problem for certain products. And at the time, we found a way to do it, and that is you find a Mexican agricultural product and a U.S. buyer. And at that point, they didn't have any problems with selling the Mexican agricultural product. So you're buying the Mexican product in pesos and then bringing it to the United States and selling it in dollars. Make sure that doesn't happen. It's very complicated.
It can. And actually, it's interesting you bring that up. We had the reverse. The reverse situation was occurring in Mexico at one point when the Power Rangers became super hot and the demand had skyrocketed in Mexico. And the way that the broadcast and the licensing program was configured is the U.S. was always leading by one season, the television show and the merchandise. Well, we were down there And because there was such a large spillover from North America broadcast into Mexico, the demand for the current season was there. So we were there at a trade show, and both the US licensees and Mexico licensees were, really on us saying, hey, you got to give us the current season because the demand is here. And they're even at that time, Kmart was a big player. They weren't getting their products. So what Kmart was doing is they were taking the US products, the US Power Ranger products in their store, slapping them with labels and shipping them to Mexico so they could take advantage of, the hot demand. So I share that story only because it's a little bit of a reverse scenario of what happened. Now, of course, that had to come to an end because that was, in effect, the US licensees whose products were going to Mexico who didn't have rights to Mexico were technically in violation.
Yeah. Okay, you bring up
So,
another point that, if, and what you mentioned was what they call the gray market.
yeah.
That's where the products get distributed in countries you don't want them distributed. So you make that part of the licensing agreement that they're limited to their license area, and that they can, make it a very strict limitation, make it a very serious offense, especially if you're giving manufacturing away as part of the licensing deal. If you're having your Chinese manufacturing done, you also want to make sure that they aren't doing anything into the gray market. And usually you'll find out it's in the gray market one of two ways. One is you'll get an email complaining about the quality from some country you've never even heard of. And the other is that all of a sudden someone's bringing in a product that for service at one of your service centers, and you've never seen that product before, but it's got your brand and name on it. So those are some of the things you want to watch out for. But I think the main thing, and this, I never thought of licensing a product until I started talking with Rand. And I thought, this is a heck of a way to save a lot of money, a lot of aggravation. And, the key is finding the right partner. And, I think Brandon and I have quite a bit of experience in that. I found for a company I was working for, I found a partner in Mexico, and they took the units from almost zero to 9,000 a year in just 2 years, and they were manufacturing it there. So it's an excellent way to do stuff. We did it as a joint venture, and we still had expenses involved, but I think just going with a license is so much less expensive than trying to set up an operation, either as a distributor, representative, or a subsidiary. It's just so much easier.
Well, and it makes a lot more sense today. I mean, regard any product today that's being made, given the up and coming economies around the world, especially in Latin America. Today, there's manufacturers and distribution and retail that exist in just about every country. And they've got terrific capabilities, manufacturing facilities. They're working in China as well and other places. So, it's not necessarily, like I say, it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel. I mean, if you've already got partners there and you don't already have a presence internationally, from my perspective, it makes more sense to license just because it's less risky. You can work with partners that have the expertise there, that are already set up to have the distribution channels. You can bring in experts such as yourself to monitor the situation on the ground and make sure they're doing what they're doing. And at the end of the day, it's going to be more cost effective. You're going to bring in, profit to the bottom line, and it's going to be much more efficient. Now you're just focused on working with a licensing partner. You don't have all the other operational stuff. And now you can look at, how can you innovate, bring in super duper mugs or whatever you've got. work with your partner, because partners, if you find the right partnership, it's a long-term, ideally it's long-term. And so they're going to be, looking forward to working with you to see if you've got other products that sell,
But here's
because that helps their business.
another interesting thing that happens with this whole process we're describing is you're selling, say for instance, you're selling from either your own manufacturing or Chinese manufacturing. And normally if you're selling to a distributor, say you're doing a 30% markup on your product. And here you have a licensee, and depending upon, their cost, but if you give them the manufacturing cost and they're paying you the licensing fee, then they can take that product to market much cheaper than if they were paying this distributor fee or representative fee or whatever, because their costs to you are lower, but your profit is about the same.
That's another variation. Licensing has many ways and many variations. It's not just you license the rights to make, sell, and distribute. There's distribution variations, there's production variations, there's hybrids. And many of those are constructed for just that reason, finding ways to cost effectively or economically take advantage of a market. And there's license deals in which you may, let's say you've got some proprietary elements about your mug. You don't want those to be released, some trade secrets. There are deals set up where licensees have to use an authorized manufacturer. Okay. Very common in licensing. When I was at the studios, big movie studios, one of the requirements of the licensees, especially if they were using manufacturers overseas, they had to get a manufacturer's agreement put in place that was provided by the studios, which had specific requirements, non-disclosures, things to make sure that were controlled, and the licensee was liable to make sure that their manufacturers adhered to those agreements. So what you say, or the points that you brought up there, are all very valid, and these are a lot of nuances I think that people overlook when they consider licensing in terms of what the actual returns are. Because if you were to compare them on a spreadsheet, yeah, you've got the hard cost, but there's a lot of non-hard costs, soft costs, time, errors, mistakes, you name it, okay, that go into this thing. And licensing can help you avoid a lot of those hidden or unknowns or soft costs, because you're working with a partner that, I mean, they've got a wheel that's running. They've got a wheel that works. They've already had the flat tires in the markets and know how to fix them. Okay. So there are really a lot of advantage to it, and something to take a hard look at if you're, looking for a strategy to get into
And me,
international.
I'm all about strategies, and I just thought of another one, and that is there's a concept called transfer pricing, which is the price
Yep.
that a company gives their subsidiaries. And if that is considered to be out of whack to meet the demands of a market, then the government where the subsidiary is located will step in and start fighting. Transfer pricing drives CFOs crazy. With a license, there's no such thing as transfer pricing. So you get rid of that, it makes you much more competitive around the world than these large companies that have their subsidiaries.
That's a good point. And you're touching on, the advanced strategic nuances of licensing. And that scenario that you just pointed out is one of the reasons why some of the world's largest corporations have configured their global manufacturing, sales, and distribution using a licensing model. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, what do you mean they're using a licensing model? What they do is they offshore their intellectual property, their technologies, their product, all the IP behind it, into a favorable tax jurisdiction. And then they use license agreements from that holding company to the various divisions Okay. And through that licensing agreement, they're able to address that transfer pricing issue because these agreements can provide, let's say, if they need manufacturing control, they can have the manufacturing control. So it can be done in such a way that they can avoid that. And it's done at these large corporations. And then there's even um, more advanced strategies behind using a holding company for international as it relates to holding revenues offshore, getting tax advantages, repatriating revenue at a lower tax advantage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's interesting we're having this conversation because international licensing is used at a very sophisticated level. I think most people don't even realize it. And in fact, it goes beyond that. I mean, intellectual property is used as a mechanism for these corporations to move money around the world. And that's a whole nother conversation. But it's a very, and the reason for that is at its core, IP is an asset. Okay. Like a factory, like inventory. And if you understand how to manage it, you can do some interesting things to enhance not only your bottom line, but your business value.
Now, here's the next thing. A person manufacturing those coffee cups goes on vacation to someplace in Europe, and they stop into a retail store and they see their coffee cups being sold there. And they know that it isn't the licensees doing it. They know it isn't the manufacturing doing it. So someone is actually copying their product, counterfeiting it. A very simple thing to do is to go to that person and say, okay, you can either license the product or we sue you. And as long as it's not going into markets that you care about, you go ahead and let it happen.
That's a good point. I mean, litigation is always, it's your last resort. Okay. Nobody wins in litigation, especially when it comes to intellectual property. I mean, contrary to what you hear, and you hear about these multi-million, 10 million, 20, $50 million litigation cases between the technology companies and so is going to settle. At the end of the day, those are all about creating license agreements or joint venture license agreements because it's claims and all that, but it's very expensive. So it's not a game that's to be played by smaller mid-sized businesses. And your point about seeing somebody who's knocked it off, yeah, absolutely. It's much more cost effective to go ahead and license them and let them continue to run and take the royalty. IP litigation, licensing litigation is tough. It's tough to win it. I mean, the whole infringement thing, especially when you're talking about you see your product in a country in Europe, for example, and you're a US company, and now you say you want to take action against them. It's a nightmare. You wind up spending more money than it's worth. Far better to take a low yielding license deal than to spend enormous amounts of sum litigating a case which you may or may not win. And even if you win, you probably aren't going to win your expenses and investment.
Well, I'm out of questions. Have we missed anything, Rand?
Well, you and I could spend another, 2 hours, 3 hours on this subject. I think the point we want to get across here to the folks watching is like, look, if you've got a business, a product, a technology, you're looking to expand internationally, licensing is really a strategy you really need to consider, especially today, given a lot of the changes that are going on. A lot of economies are in flux, a lot of regulatory issues, a lot of economic issues. And licensing is a great strategy for that because it's very flexible. You can make changes to it. You can adapt very quickly as opposed to setting up a direct pipeline, which has been evidenced in looking at some of the economic headlines today with tariffs and things like that. When you're direct, it's very restrictive. Something comes along to significantly change the market, and you've got a big headache financially as well as logistically. Whereas licensing allows you to make changes very quickly because you can adapt to that through the license agreement, finding other licensees, whatever the case is, and working with somebody such as yourself who's got boots on the ground, when these changes occur, you got the ability to say, look, we can go work with this person, we can switch to this distributor. You've got so many options and so much more flexibility, a lot more flexibility. So, as I said, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think the takeaway message here is if you're going international, consider licensing, because it really can be one of your best and most effective strategies to get into international markets.
Okay, maybe we can do something later on, in a couple months, come back to the subject and cover stuff that maybe we're both getting questions about.
Absolutely, sure.
As I mentioned to my subscribers, tomorrow I'm leaving for Nigeria, and Nigeria is not known for its excellent internet service. So I may be a little bit more difficult to contact, but I will eventually get that email if you send it. And your answer will eventually get back to you. I talk with my wife, who is Nigerian, every day, and it's like a hit and miss with how good the network is working. So, but that said, probably my next video will be within a 6-week period, and we're going to do another video on something interesting that has to do with you and the international market. Thank you.
Great. Well, good talking to you, Bob. Look forward to our next conversation.
Okay.
Bye-bye.